some things about this book that I've written on settlement and local histories of the early Deccan. And I decided that because there is always a tendency of authors to sort of, just go on and on and on what they've written. So I've kind of divided this conversation into 3 parts, maybe unequal parts. In the first part, I just very briefly talk about the why and the what of the book. And then I focus a bit on the crux of what I've done in this book and its interpretations. And also maybe perhaps give those who are not familiar with the Deccan something of an idea about how the different chapters and different sections of the book are laid out. And the third most important part I thought would be that I raise some questions and show some illustrations, and then this should continue into the Q&A. And I mean, I think that's when the real conversation will start. So why? Actually, for most of us who are born and brought up in North India, there's very little that we know about south of the Vindhyas. So my teaching assignments at the University of Hyderabad led to several courses that I had to develop and teach when I was in Hyderabad. And when one drew upon the general books on South Indian history, which were available, textbooks, I mean, the Deccan was very partially or marginally or minimally discussed. And this was like very painful because the large majority of students in the early years of the inception of the university actually came from the region that I define as the Deccan, primarily Andhra Pradesh, to some extent Maharashtra, and of course Karnataka and all. It was really problematic as to how we would address issues about the immediately surrounding history of where we were located. So in 1993, working with students and having contributions by them also, I published a book called the Social and Economic History of the Deccan, Some Interpretations. It was a kind of a schematic collection of papers, but primarily the focus over here was on to move away from that entangled question that most of the political histories of the region were dealing with at that point in time, namely trying to find out the original homeland of the Shatavahanas, the most important dynasty that ruled in these parts. And second, what was their chronology? A knotted problem, still continues to be a knotted problem. So therefore, I thought that let's focus away from events into understanding the larger processes of historical change. So that's where we were. I realized that, well, I did this book, but then in 2019, suddenly the publisher said, we need a reprint edition because there are no more copies. And to my surprise, I mean, there weren't any other texts that could fill in the gap. So even till now, there is such a lack of systematic accounts for so we get divided into the Ganga Valley civilization or the Indus or the Kaveri and so on and so forth. And therefore something in the middle gets missed out. It sort of acts like a bridge, but nobody realizes that the bridge also has to be stable, right? Otherwise, how can you cross it? And so therefore this notion of the stability of the region and what it really entails for the very, very early periods, what we would call the foundations of culture and civilization in this part of the country, I thought was a desideratum, particularly since living in Hyderabad, it also was something that I was, really, I really enjoyed, and that was the very rich medieval history of the city as well as of the region. And this had been written about, this was discussed primarily because of the extant monuments, the language, etc. But then, one needed to go back, and I was egged on to going back. And the second thing that struck me was this very old, very ancient landscape that after joining the Society to Save Rocks in Hyderabad, I learned it was 2,500 million years old. And the secretary of the society told me that, we are not just saving rocks. By the way, she gave me an article in which she wrote, and I quote over here, rocks sustain a very special ecosystem with flora and fauna, and once destroyed, they never grow back. So it's not just simply the unique landscape, but it's the kind of ecosystem and it's the kind of life that revolved around this ecosystem over historical time that needed to be addressed, right? So there were these two things. On the one hand, a very rich, dynamic, very well-woven, textured history of the medieval times and very well illustrated and documented. On the other hand, this very ancient historical geological landscape. And in between, there was this very important phase of history that we only got to know in bits and pieces. It's just a dynasty here, a dynasty there, the rise of many of these dynasties, their downfall, and the great urge after the formation of the linguistic states, the great urge of many of the linguistic states, particularly Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh at that time, before 2014, everybody vying with each other to find the pristine, original civilization growing in their particular bounded space. So it didn't matter whether dynasties were ruling across linguistic states, but for the purpose of that particular agenda, just as the history of the nation state, you're looking for origins, you're looking for purity, you're looking for something very ancient, so that the identity of the present day state can be hinged upon. So I thought that this we need to get away from some of these entangled questions. They're never going to be solved unless we get a lot more information on the subject. And right away, I must mention to you that unlike the Ganges Valley or even the Tamil regions, for the Deccan of the very, very early period, we don't have a corpus of literary texts. We do have the Gatha Shapsati and we do have inscriptions, but an entire corpus of literary texts is not available. And so therefore, what you're always doing is finding archaeological evidence, some artifacts, some monuments, and then trying to relate it not only to the inscriptions, but primarily, and this was kind of a problem, you're primarily linking it up to literary evidence that comes from regions north of the Vindhyas. So their perceptions of the region become the historical platform on which we must build. This also I found a little problematic, and I'll talk about that. Now, in a sentence, if I have to place before you, this is obviously not a dynastic history of the Deccan. It is also not a descriptive book in the sense that it does not describe each and every aspect of Deccan's history. Rather, it is a description of settlements and their interconnectedness, and placing these settlements within the larger forces of historical change that are not confined only to the Deccan, but the way in which the Deccan emerges in this scenario. Now, what writing this book enabled me to do is the following. And this is an endeavor I think most historians amongst all of us who are here endeavor to do. One was that one needed to get away from labeling the Hindu India and the Muslim India. And I wondered, very conveniently, we forget Buddhist India. The Deccan of the period I'm discussing is full of Buddhist monuments, but we never use Buddhist Deccan. Then the question of periodization, this was also problematic in ancient India, medieval India, but these don't get identically fixtured on regional histories. And why would regional histories only be treated in larger texts, North Indian textual traditions or South Indian, as when a particular dynasty becomes a so-called empire, the Shatavahanas, the Chalukyas, or the Rashtrakutas, and so on and so forth. So there is this, there is a kind of rejection of the large framework of the Deccan as an identity, and only it like a little hill coming up whenever there is political dynasty. And most importantly, in the books that literature survey that I did, which I'll mention a bit just now, is that all the time the political history is prominent and everything else, social history, economic history, cultural history, history of art, all that is put into compartments. So we may have great writings on Ajanta art, or we have great writings on, religious traditions and so on and so forth. But these are not integrated into the larger narrative. So I asked a question, simple question. In fact, I asked several questions. What were the type of historical changes that were replicated in the Deccan from wherever, right? In contact with the North or the South, what was replicated? What was absent from these traditions? And finally, even if they were present, even if, like, for example, the Brahmi script and so on and so forth, even if it was presented, in what form did it emerge? And where did it emerge? Was it uniformly found everywhere, all over, or were there niche areas where this was found? So these are some of the questions. And as I said, in the preliminaries, everybody asked me, why the history of the Deccan? Why don't we consider history of South India? I mean, the Deccan is an integral part of South India. So, I mean, there's no real, peninsular India as a whole can be treated. So something that really struck my mind was that when I did the literature survey, was way back in the 19th century, in 1885, I do believe, and again then in 1892, one of the first histories that we have south of the Vindhyas is the history of the Deccan by R.G. Bhandarkar. And it's not a history of South India, it's primarily a history of that portion of the Deccan, which is today called Maharashtra. But the disturbing point about this book, obviously it was written in the latter half of the 19th century, was that it used a lot of Puranic and Vedic and other literature to define what is the Deccan. And sadly, I should say, the inhabitants of the Deccan were called Dasyus, but this is what the early texts refer, the Aitreya Brahmana and so on and so forth, referred to as people living beyond the borders. There's a very famous reference in the Aitreya Brahmana that the sage Vishwamitra cursed his son to go and inhabit regions south of the, borders, on the borders. And who were these cursed sons? They were the Mutibas, the Shabaras, the Andhras, etc. And all these people were supposed to be called Dasyus in that verse. And it's surprising that the impact of Bhandarkar's work on even the textbooks that came up in the Telugu Academy brought out textbooks under the composite state of Andhra Pradesh, and even they began their histories with this lack or this negative image of what the region was. The next important publication was by the great Ghulam Yazdani, the first director of the director of the Department of Archaeology under His Highness the Nizam's dominions, and he located Deccan to be the political territoriality of the Nizam's dominion. And he, of course, we can't dismiss all the work that he did. He did fantastic work in documenting the Ajanta frescoes. He excavated at Kondapur. He did the Bidar work. And therefore, a database was like generated under his directorship. But the sad thing was that he edited this volume and he divided the chapters dynasty-wise. So one dynasty somebody wrote about, one dynasty somebody wrote about. There was a fantastic chapter on the historical geography of the Deccan by H.C. Ray Chaudhary, that is still a classic. And then, of course, he had his own piece on art and culture and so on. But, you know, this tendency to simply have the framework of dynastic history, because political elites needed to have a sense of what they were ruling, right? So that tendency continued. And finally, of course, I would suggest, before we proceed to what I did, I would suggest that there were three ways in which the history of the Deccan became subsumed. One was that a lot of people thought it was okay to subsume it under the entity of South India, and the classic work of Nilakanta Shastri from prehistoric times up to the fall of Vijayanagar is an example. He followed the same pattern of what Bhandarkar had done, except that he only wrote about the Deccan when there was a particular dynasty there. And another thing that he brought in, and this is again problematic, is that he brought in the whole issue of Aryanization. the concept of Aryanization. So who are the agents of Aryanization? I mean, I refute that in the sense that if at all we have to talk about influences coming from north of the Vindhyas, then it is surely not Aryan influences, but influences coming through the Buddhist and Jain monks and so on, historically that has been documented. And then the second way, and by the way, Oxford University Press has only recently brought out another concise history of South India, where of course by Nobuo Karashima, some of you may know him, the Japanese scholar. And in this book, it's a concise history of South India up to colonial times. The very word concise indicates that every segment has a very limited amount of information, but one must give credit to Karashima that he did move north of the river Pennar and gave some visibility to the kind of society that was inhabited in what we call the Deccan regions. The second way, of course, is I've already mentioned that linguistic states, their individual, there was a plethora, proliferation of histories of Andhra Pradesh, Maharashtra, Karnataka, Goa, and so on and so forth. So I won't go into too many details about that, but let me tell you one thing which is very striking, that before history, before questions of identity and history come into being, prehistoric and protohistoric studies, especially led by the Deccan College Pune, continue and very freely use the terminology Deccan to define the distribution pattern of the way in which these cultures spread out, the material cultures, so to speak, the topography, the spread of these cultures from Stone Age times to the Neolithic times and so on. And Olchin, who was a very well-known archaeologist way back in 1993, had a very interesting title, Neolithic Cattle Keepers of South India, the Ash Mounds of the Deccan. Obviously, this indicates that there is something peculiar about the Deccan in the ash mounds that are available to us only in some areas, not in the far south, but primarily in the Deccan zones. Of course, there's a long history about what these ash mounds are. And just last year, Professor Padaya from Deccan, the former professor, formerly of the Deccan College, he brought out another book on the ash mounds of the Deccan, and he made some very interesting observations, which I thought I could also share with you. And he says that the nature of the agro-pastoral villages that we have in the Deccan have a kind of let's say, tenacity of survival. And he writes, if I can find the quote, yes, he writes, I quote, "The larger political and socio-religious conditions may have undergone dramatic changes across time, but these had little or no effect on the basic structure of village-based agro-pastoral life, which had its genesis in Neolithic period and were tied tightly to the region's resource base." We can disagree with some parts of this quotation, but the important point that is being emphasized is on the particularity of the resource base and the terrain that gave rise to us. It's not just a coincidence that ICRISAT, the organization that looks after cropping in the semi-arid tropics, is located not far from Hyderabad, and they are also dealing with the way in which particular landscapes gives rise to particular kinds of millets and other crops, and they are using their experiments here to apply them to Africa. Now, this is just the introduction, a few preliminary statements, and I haven't done justice to historiography and stuff like that, but we can always talk about this. Now, what is this book of mine? What's the crux of this book? It's not a place name studies, because people will get an image that settlements and local histories must be place name studies. Place name studies was very popular in the early half of the 20th century. And this was basically part of the Cunningham started the historical geography of the subcontinent. Many people took up this, and they used many inscriptions, literature. There was very little archaeology that was used to do these place name studies. But anyway, I have not done a place name study. This is not a book about place name studies. Secondly, the big problem that I had is that unlike North India, unlike the Buddhist literature that talks about Janapadas and Mahajanapadas for the early period, we don't have, as I said, the literary text. We have to depend maybe on Buddhist literature, or maybe as I follow in this regard, I follow B.D. Chattopadhyay, who talked about Janapada-like entities, and he defined these entities being based on coins that were with legends and names of kings, much before the rise of the Shatavahanas, and he identified certain localities. And I draw upon that. I draw upon that idea of Janapada-like like entities or localities, and I do emphasize on these coins because, as is well known for scholars who are working on South India, Andhra Pradesh government was, before 2014, was very active in its archaeological excavations, and so also was Maharashtra under the aegis of the Deccan College. It was a bit iffy for other regions of South India, but archaeology still has not given us systematic, zonal data, so to speak. So one is still, having issues about how to use archaeological data, but nonetheless, the coins became a very significant way as markers of identifying these localities. So in the main, my argument, I'll just give that to you right away. In the main, my argument is as follows, that these settlements that I will show you maps about just now, they are in a continual state of negotiating with each other. In other words, these settlements highlight the way social groups, and how do I get to know about the social groups? The artifacts that they produce, the small objects that they produce, the monuments that they produce, and how they establish networks between them. So for example, you have iron producing or iron smelting areas, bean producing areas, lots of small images of the Buddha located in some settlement. What were they doing? What were all these beads in one settlement, or what were all these iron articles in one settlement doing? No, obviously not for the consumption of the locality only, but of course exchanged, small scale exchange happening across these regions. And most significantly, of course, the whole question of monastic habitations. I'll show you a map just now where they interacted with merchants and traders. So it's not just simply this small scale craft production. They're also traders and methods. So where did they get their surplus from? What were they doing? Where were they carrying from? And we get to know about these merchants and traders in a lot of inscriptional material, both in the Western Deccan as well as in the Eastern Deccan, where names of people giving these, carrying with them objects or donating these objects to the Sangha, etc. So one has, mapped these out, but tried to understand what were the localities they were coming from, and so on and so forth. And finally, what is fascinating for me is, and this is not only me, there are scholars like Akira Shimada, whose book on relooking at Amravati. There are many other scholars who are looking at the the history of art and so on. Everybody is now seriously looking at the fact that how do you locate everything to be attributed to the great Shatavahana dynasty or the Ikshvaku dynasty. There are many chiefs, heads of goshtis as they are called, heads of negamas. All these people were quite wealthy, endowed with wealth. They also had a lot of local power that made them issue coins with their names on them. And these people then lived in their own localities, but they exchanged with localities in their proximity. So the evidence is complex. Obviously, for this early period, since we don't have a corpus of literary texts, we have to make some sense of the inscriptions, the artifacts, the coins and all. And somehow or the other, when I was reading Donna Haraway's neural networks. And I thought that if we make people central to these networks, then we'll get some idea about why and how these settlements became what they were. So it's not just the static archaeological data there or the inscribed word over there, but it's like trying to look at the interconnectedness between these groups. Sorry about this phone call. Now, maybe what I should do now is he's come. What I should do now is maybe take you to the structure of the book, and also maybe share my screen and show you the settlements that I have mapped, and also some that I have borrowed from work of others. What is before I go there, I said that I don't think that Aryanization as a viable model is a thing, because all these interconnectedness, etc., that I was talking about, there is one can see a significant role of Buddhist monks and also Jain monks traveling through the Deccan to the Tamil areas, and the Buddhist monks traveling into Sri Lanka and so on and so forth. So if at all influences came, they came through these monks. And what is the evidence for that? You don't find northern black polished ware pottery as endemic to the Deccan. The Deccan is known for its black and red ware, or just the red ware pottery. Now, northern black polished ware is particular to northeastern India, that is Bihar, eastern Uttar Pradesh and all. You find remnants of this both in the western Deccan as well as in the eastern Deccan. And last but not least, the Brahmi script, because Ashokan inscriptions are found in the eastern Deccan, the southern Deccan, and the western Deccan. There's a kind of a serious absence in what we call the central Deccan. But I was told the other day on a WhatsApp message by Srinivasan, I don't know whether he's there, that they are doing some village-to-village surveys in Medak district. And he says that they have found a Brahmi inscription of the 3rd century BC, which says Deva Nam. And it is prefixes Nandipada. That's a symbol. And then he thinks that this Deva Nam is probably Deva Nam Priyadashi. But we have to wait for the rest of the excavation of this 90 hectares mound, which they have found, I think, in Kulcharam village of Medak district. So anyway, that's for the future. So the structure of the book then is as follows. I've divided it into 3 parts. The first part is called Establishing the Terrain. The second part is called Standing on the Particular. And third is called Accessing the Other. And for the first part, in establishing the terrain, I raised some, it's not just simply the physical geography of the Deccan, but I'm going back to looking at the evolution of the word Deccan itself, because Deccan is an anglicized word of some of us who are in Hyderabad know is Dakkan. Dakkan, the Persian word that is used to describe the Dakkan sultanates and all that. But much before that, the Buddhist texts refer to what is called Dakhina Path, Dakhina, K-H-I-N-A, Dakhina Path, Avanti Dakhina Path, where they emphasize that the soil is very hard in these areas and the monks can wear footwear to travel through this Avanti Dakhina Path. Of course, some other scholars look at Dakshina Path, which is referred to in the Arthashastra and all, but Dakshina Path also subsumes the far south. But the Dakshina Path and Dakshina Path, both these terms, the word Dakshina Path is found, of course, in the Shatavahana inscriptions, the famous Naneghat inscription of Queen Naganika. She refers to her husband Gautami Putra Shatkarni as Dakshina Path Pati, that is the lord of Dakshina Path. And the Nasik inscription of Queen Balashri, again a Shatavahana queen, she, in that inscription, we have the components of the Deccan, which I read: Asaka, Asika, Muluka, Suratha, Kukura, Apranta, Anupa, Vidarbha, Akara, and Avanti. So, sort of Janapada-like entities which Bhatia was talking about. But these entities are all north of the river Pennar and not south of it. We can literally take them as entities that stayed on, but I argue in the spatial descriptions that I give in the book that boundaries were always flexible, they were always changing, but there is an essence of identifying some entities, and this we get to know mainly because of the coins and the legends on coins and so on and so forth. So let me just pause over here and share my screen and show you a couple of maps on the different, of course, it will also define what I understand by the Deccan. It defines to you some of the settlements that I have discussed in the book. And it also tells you about types of settlement, okay? So now sharing the screen with all of you. So, can you see the screen? Yeah. Okay. Is it visible? Yeah, you can see the screen. Okay, okay, good, good, good. So in delineating the area of study, I took broad geographical features south of the Vindhyas, demarcating the river Narmada in the north and the river Pennar in the south, and divided
Aloka,
it into...
sorry, there seems to be some problem because what we are seeing is just slideshow and resume slideshow.
Professor, you just have to click the resume
Okay.
slideshow.
Yeah. Is that okay?
Yeah. Can you, yes, yes. Now it is fine, madam.
Okay, okay. There's some message came there. Sorry about that. So this was the area of study with the river Narmada in the south, the Pennar in the south, the Mysore Plateau being an important demarcating thing in the south. And then I divided it into 4 sub-regions, the Western Deccan as A, the Central Deccan as B, and the Eastern Deccan as C, and the Southern Deccan as D. And this sort of blurred the political boundaries that usually scholars use, also blurred the modern day linguistic boundaries. And we looked at entities that were, like for example, in B, the core areas of habitation and all were around the mid-Godavari Valley. Then in the eastern areas, there were the lower Krishna Valley. Then you had the Western Ghats and so on and so forth, which had a lot of historical evidence. And of course, as everybody knows, in the Southern Deccan, you have the famous collection of the earliest inscriptions we have for the region, namely Ashokan Inscription. Now, how do we proceed to the next? Yeah, okay. So one of the things I have done as one of the immediate chapter after I discussed the terrain is to look at focused studies on key sub-regions. So there we have the sites around the mid-Godavari Valley and the sites in the lower Krishna Valley, but that doesn't mean that in other chapters I've not looked at these other settlements. All these settlements that have been, I think, are either having a substantial amount of inscriptions or have been excavated either by the Deccan College or by the State Department of Archaeology and Museums, Government of Andhra Pradesh, or by the State Department of Archaeology, Government of Karnataka, and so on and so forth, right? So I'm putting these in the context of the far south because the number of, the other day, Professor Subrayalu and we have been discussing this, the archaeological sites in the far south, only recently people have started looking at them in a, primarily because they have the Shangam text, so therefore there's no need to focus too much on the archaeological aspects. And then of course, there is a concentration, there's a very deep concentration of sites in the lower Krishna basin and very famous settlements. And I think there is a kind of historiographical history. People have been documenting this part of the country for a longer period, and so therefore there is this concentration. But it's not true only of the lower Krishna Valley. That it's also true of, and here you can see, of course, this is a map of the government of Andhra Pradesh, the state of Andhra Pradesh, because I've taken this from Wikipedia Commons, and the scholar who has done this before 2012. So he's mapped all the Buddhist settlements in terms of the rock cut monasteries, the larger monasteries, the stupas, the rock edicts, and placed them the way they were. And all the sites that I discussed are located in this map. And you see that it's only on the southwestern corner that you have 3 places where you have rock edicts. Right? Of course, if you extend the map into Karnataka and Maharashtra, then of course you also have many more Ashokan edicts. And all these, by the way, are minor rock edicts, except for one at Yaragudi, which is a major rock edict of Ashoka. And finally, acknowledgements to Himanshu Prabha Ray. There is a systematic documentation that has already been done of the port towns, the settlements, and the cave settlements, and the Buddhist monasteries in the Western Deccan. So the Western Deccan and the Eastern Deccan have had a large concentration of work that has been done, whereas in the central and the southern Deccan, we have only marginal studies. See, take a look at this map. The mid-Godavari Valley is the absolute zero. I mean, as though nothing existed. And subsequently, of course, when documentation did begin to happen, we find that some of these mid-Godavari settlements were very unique. They are the ones that produced the earliest coins with legends, names of kings, and so on and so forth. They also were iron generating sites. And there is a density of population over here, which is not mapped at all in this this is a 1986 map. So I'll stop the share over here, and then we'll come back to illustrations later. So now, what do we do with these subregions? So what I did was, I took up local histories of these zonal areas. And the first zonal area, as I said, that I took up was the local polities of, I compared the local polities or state formation, if you want to call it, state formation in the mid-Godavari Valley with the lower Krishna Valley. This is important. Of course, I did this much before the formation of the state of Telangana in 2014. But of course, it sort of now rings a bell that there were certain peculiar features of the way in which the processes of state formation took place in different zones. There were similarities as well. So one of the major similarities, as I've been saying throughout, is the evidence of coins. And so you have a concentrated particular type of coinage of kings that are called Gopa kings in the mid-Godavari Valley. They are pre-Shatavahana. And in the lower Krishna Valley, you have coins of what are called Sada kings, found at Vadamanu in particular, but generally spread out. There is also an inscription of the Sadas and all. And these are also pre-Shatavahana. So what is happening over here is that the transition from what we call in archaeological terms the megalithic phase of habitation, that is the early iron using cultures of the Deccan and the South, and their transition into the early historic period is not marked only by the Mauryan presence, but rather it is a processes of internal change that are also happening, which are evident to us through these local polities becoming powerful, right? So to make this complicated story very simple, what I did was I looked at the theory of professional co-people, which Irwin Rouse had used, which argued that, I quote, the professional and sustaining co-people share civilization. They may be both urban, both rural, or one may be urban and one rural. And drawing on this, I argued that these sustaining co-people engage with each other to produce local polities. Now, these local polities are not just simply coins. At a place called Kotalingala, Dhulikatta, Pedabankur in the mid-Godavari Valley, you have fortifications, you have granaries, you have wells, very well-constructed wells, which continue to be used even now. And you have a whole lot of artifacts, you have furnaces, you have all kinds of materials. And if you look at the lower Krishna Valley, you don't have iron tools and so on and so forth. You have the coins, you have inscribed names. The famous Bhattiprolu inscription you have from there, you have Guntepalli, you have early Amravati, you have Vadamanu. All these show a similar transition. And it is in these polities, it's in the context of these polities that the external influences of the Mauryas begin to take place. So there is some kind of a stop. So if the mid-Godavari people are the co-sustaining, the professional co-sustaining people, in the coastal areas, I use Patricia Springbok, who says that these societies are more transactional. Power is created by interactions, exchanges, and those structures of social life that provide a multiplicity of forums for negotiation, transaction, and exchange. So these are not static societies in some antiquity, just lying there as imbecile entities, but very dynamic and very interactive. Then I move on to spreading this discussion into other subregions, and I have a section in the first part on urban centers. And over here I raise fundamental questions about why we should not use labels for even regional history. Andhra, Shatvahana, Buddhist, Roman. I mean, these are not very suitable labels that enable you to really come to know about what exactly a particular settlement is. There may be a Roman coin, that doesn't make it a Roman settlement. There may be even wine jars found in excavations, still doesn't make it Roman settlement. Just because there are remnants of one or two sculptures from the indicating Buddhism doesn't make it a Buddhist site. So these labels I question in that third chapter, and I then move on to questioning the theories of urbanization, the impositions that have been done for the Deccan. That is, you have the famous theories of urbanization for North India, where they try to explain spread of iron technology, spread of agrarian surplus, rise of urban centers, and so on and so forth. And you have scholars like Clarence Maloney and others saying, and I quote, "There is no evidence of early civilization between the gold-bearing zones of Karnataka and Madurai. Likewise, the tract between the Godavari and the Kaveri has little to offer as far as civilization is concerned." All this is really problematic because they are using theoretical models of river valley civilizations. The nature of agrarian production there, a dominant agrarian mode of production, doesn't apply to regions south of the Vindhyas. This is mixed farming country, agro-pastoral country. So therefore, you have a lot of iron technology, but this does not lead to the emergence of urban centers the way we have urban centers in other belts or in other. And in fact, H. Sarkar, a very famous archaeologist, 1986, he gave the presidential address to the Andhra Pradesh History Congress in 1986 at Guntur, and he said that, all these years we have been documenting and talking about Buddhist monuments, the great monumentality of the stupas, the chaityas, etc., but we have never bothered about the hinterland. What supported these monumental constructions? Who were the people? Who were the consumers? How did they produce the wealth to be able to, did all this wealth come from outside? Was it not generated by communities that were living in and around these monuments? So also the Buddhist cave temples of Western India, were these the monks and were these the traders and merchants only who came and excavated the cave? What about the hinterland of Nashik and Nanegat and Bedza and Junnar and so on and so forth? What was the relationship between the, now a lot of work has gone on. Scholars like Lars Fogel and Gregory Chopin, all these people are trying to look at the relationship between the monks and the community at large. And this is something that I discuss in the second part of the book. And the first essay, which some of you may have read, and it is a republication from a Brill book that was published in 2014 on Kondapur. And Kondapur gives us this fascinating history, which Yazdani, who excavated there, called it a Buddhist center. In 2009-11, when it was excavated again by Maheshwari, she said, no, this is not a Buddhist settlement. This is actually, there are Vedic altars and there are shrines, there are Hindu shrines over there. And therefore, I raise a fundamental question: how can archaeology be interpreted? I'll show you some illustrations of Kondapur. What these scholars totally forget in labeling is that it was such a cosmopolitan center. It produced about 50,000 or more beads. An entire book was written on the beads of Kondapur. What were these thousands and thousands of beads doing at a particular settlement? Or that there was so much of Roman coinage of coins of Tiberius and of Augustus lying over here, terracottas of a fantastic kind. There were shrines of non-Buddhist, non-Brahminical, whatever you want to call them, Lajja Gauris and others. So it was truly a cosmopolitan center where people traveled through. It's in the heart of the Deccan, just 40 kilometers away from Hyderabad. So maybe people traveling from the Eastern Deccan into the Western Deccan, took them a long time to travel, would have a sojourn at Kondapur. So I'm looking at how archaeology is not just a presentation of mere facts. I mean, they're not just available over there. I think that they need interpretation and they need a questioning. Automatically, you cannot just use an archaeological material or piece of information and describe a settlement. So it's very simple. It seems very simple for scholars, but it's not so simple. Talking about beads, Taxila, which is a famous site, and Nagarjun Konda, which is even more famous, only had 700 or 500 beads things. So, I mean, if you compare the quantum of beads that were found over here, it obviously indicates that it was a very huge settlement with a lot of people working on this industry. And then I move on, and standing on the particular, I move on to looking at a particular Buddhist viharas, one in Totalakonda near Vishakhapatnam, and the other in Telangana, that is near Nalgonda, called Fanigiri. Those of you who live in Hyderabad must go to Fanigiri. Those who live in Andhra Pradesh must go to Totalakonda and Bavikonda. And these are fascinating hill settlements of viharas. And what I discuss over here is the water management, systems of water, and how water was collected for the use of monks. But that's not all. Following the work of Lars Fogan in particular, because he worked on Totalakonda and Bavikonda, the relationship that these viharas had with the village settlements at the base of the hill. What he's argued is that the rituals that were followed at the base of the hill impacted the way the monks were living and how they were interacting with the community. Similarly, if you look at Fanigiri, it is surrounded by other hills. You have Vardhaman, Kota, Trumulgiri, and others. And there are lots and lots of fields, agricultural fields around these hills. So the Buddhist monks began to develop a very close relationship with the agrarian hinterlands in the midst of which they were living. And the monks were thus not just simply people living in solitude. There's fantastic sculpture, classical sculpture from Fanigiri. There is also fantastic coinage, terracottas, inscriptions that are found. What were coins doing at these vihara and Buddhist settlements? So that's the particular second chapter of standing on the particular. The third is like I'm moving into the early medieval now, from the ancient, from the prehistoric ancient to the early medieval. And I'll take a look at the particularity of a place called Patancheru. Some of you may know it, again, the Hyderabadis would, Patancheru. And here, it's very interesting. It's a market town, but all the evidence that is extant, that is remaining, the inscriptions tell us about the Chalukyan, Badami Chalukyas, Kalaya, all the dynasties that apparently had their origin in Karnataka, but they were all in close proximity with a place called Pottalakere, that is Patancheru. And they inhabited this whole area and have left behind fantastic sculptural evidence. And they have also left behind documentation of the Jains that were very, very powerful. There is, according to literary references, Kannada literary references, there were about 800 Jain basadis in this area. And some remnants of the Jain sculptural evidence is also there. And the interesting thing about Patancheru is that there is a continuity of settlements right down to the present times. So it has been very difficult to excavate over here, except the 1973 excavation that was done within the ICRISAT campus that revealed a big, huge sun temple over there. And then I move on to an interesting section, and the last section of the book, which is called Accessing the Other. And here, you see, I had told you about the problems that I have with periodization. I mean, here I'm looking at, I've entitled it Conversations at Nagarjunkonda, but I'm using contemporary Mulk-Raj Anand's writings on what Nagarjuna Konda must have been in the early historic times. Because why did he do this? Because Nehru was very keen on setting up the temples of modern India, and salvage archaeology had to be done around Nagarjuna Konda, and so therefore everything was quickly sort of taken up to the hillside. A museum was set up. So everything you see in Nagarjuna Konda now is an uprooted material. But what Mulk-Raj Anand did was, he talked about these conversations where he talked about people coming from different parts, from Gandhara, from Sri Lanka, the Andhras, the Shilpins, the Chenchus, and various social groups conversing with each other in this fictitious story. So what I did was, I looked at this fictitious story, and then I went into the inscriptions and into the objects that are available at Nagarjuna Konda and the sculpture, and I tried to look at the proximity of these sculptural and inscriptional evidence to see whether indeed this was a place where people met, where accessing the other was important. The Roman material, in fact, it was an important center for the Chinese who came to take all those Buddhist texts some of those Buddhist texts are now available to us only in Chinese translations. And then I move on to another early medieval settlement, that is Shravanabelgola, moving into Karnataka, where you have where I have a discussion on inscriptions of the Jains and the way in which renunciation and pilgrimage. I juxtapose the two because all these faiths, whether it's the Buddhists or the Jains, they were undergoing a transformation in their location here in the Deccan. And so there's a lot of discussion on how one should not have ownership of things, no rituals should be there, etc. But tendencies were to the opposite. In fact, the Deccan has yielded the very unique evidence in Anantapur of the Yapanias. Yapanias are very not unknown, they were very well known at that point in time because they were the gurus of the Gangas. They were a particular sect of very radical sect of Jains, very different from the Shvetambaras, certainly, but had some similarities with the Digambaras, who were naked, what do you call it, Jain monks. So I take a look at this. It's a famous site. Why? The great Mauryan king, and Bhadrabhadu, when there was a famine in the north, they all migrated to Shravanabelgola. Why Shravanabelgola? And of course, there is this colossal Gomateshwara statue also over there. So I take a look at the relationship between the inscriptional evidence and the debates that went on within the Jain intellectuals or Jain monks on whether renunciation was an ideal or pilgrimage was. And finally, again, taking a risk, because this is something that I think is very relevant to the larger argument in my book. I move on to oral history because the study that is the last study of accessing the other is this place called Nanagarambura, which is just at the back of our university, which is from a village in the last 10 years or 15 years. From being a small village, it has become a megapolis. It's an SEZ, and so in the oral history project, we looked at all these relationships, the relationship between pastoralism, agriculture, the use of water resources, and the way in which these communities remember their past. I learned a lot. The past is not an alien land for them. It's very much their present. It sort of harks back to what Carr tells us, all history is contemporary history. They don't look at history as something, an alien back. I mean, like Serto says, some deep down, something that has happened. It's very much their lives. And in accessing the other, the interesting facet of this settlement was that more than 50% of the population were Lodha Khatris from Uttar Pradesh. And the rest of them were Malas, Madigas, Kumaras, Chakkalis, and so on and so forth. So it was a very interesting case study, which also had a 500-year-old temple. It is, of course, in disuse, but it has been renovated, an innumerable number of shrines. It brings us to the particularity of not just simply looking at big monuments, but also looking at small fragmentary pieces of information, their histories, and the way in which they played out. So, okay, in conclusion, I would simply try to say the following, that in my multiple Deccan histories, I want to move away from the narrative of great dynasties and great monuments to looking at smaller units of historical understanding. Maybe perhaps we don't have very fantastic source material, but I think we need to weave together fragments of information, and the role of the fragment in integrating a meta-narrative is something that we have to think about. Secondly, an overemphasis of using literary perceptions that are not endemic to the region that we are studying. Well, we can use it, we can use it to give a perspective of the region, but that shouldn't be the identity of the region, a region of negative impressions. And finally, I think that theoretical frameworks that we evolve to write about these meta-histories of the nation state, somehow or the other are not able to handle difference. And because they are not able to handle difference, those regions which, and I think the Deccan is full of multiplicity in religious faiths, multiplicities of economic modes of production. Santana did that fantastic study on the Dangars of Maharashtra. You have the Chenchus over here. You have multiple forms of livelihoods and so on and so forth. And these things, they don't easily fit in to a kind of nation state history. If it's like a history of a neatly bounded area, that may fit into the meta of a nation's history, but these don't, and therefore they're just simply left out. Actually, I was so impressed when I came here to Hyderabad that Arudra was writing a history of Telugu literature at that time, the famous Telugu scholar. And, he told me, he said, madam, I have to take a look at all those coins you were mentioning, because I need to go back to those coins to see the origin of words. So therefore, my history of Telugu literature would go back to those simple words and those simple things that are found in those coins, not maybe to a literary narrative thing. Now, I'll end by saying the following. Contemporary concerns make us look at history in a certain way from the modern perspective of fitting regions into a meta-narrative of a nation-state's history. This unconsciously looks at ruptures in the way regions evolve, rather than elements of continuity. Being multiple histories, the Deccan provides interesting avenues for us to look at how both rupture and continuity allowed historical change. I have tried to integrate topography, material culture, monuments, coins, artifacts, and beyond merely the written word to write history. Makes this a complex exercise, but then anything dynamic and anything living is complex. I end on that note, and Megha and Ranita will tell me whether there's time if I can show pictures, but I could show the pictures while questions are being asked also. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Professor. I'd say, see, we have one question so far, so I'd say you could show us the images, and that might spark off more questions also.
Okay,
Yeah,
good. So, okay. So this is the first set of material that I'm sharing with you, and these are this is the excavations that were done in 81-82 at those famous sites Kotalingala, Gulikata, and Pedabankuru. And there are different types of monuments there. There's a granary on my right. There's a fortified kind of settlement at Kotalingala, and then there are innumerable Gopa King coins, which I was talking to you about. Apart from structures, there is this fascinating material of iron furrows. This my favorite, this iron scissors of the 2nd century AD from Pedabankuru. This wonderful smiling face from Kotalingala, a mask from Dhulikata next to it. And these, Arya Sharma was very fascinated by these horses on seals, and this is one from Pedabankuru. The role of horses in particular, because the megalithic society, there were 3 things: the horse, iron, and of course black and red ware pottery. And there's another seal right in the middle, which is from Dhulikata. All these fascinating materials have all been found at early historic levels. The coin, again some coins, and then what are they called, where you make coins, I'm forgetting the name. And then on the left you have an ivory comb. So look at the elements, look at these things of everyday use. I mean, what I have been trying to emphasize is not necessarily must we look at a great Buddhist stupa. Though, by the way, at Pashigaon near Kotalingala, and also at Kotalingala, at Dhulikata, some 2 kilometers away, they have found Buddhist, the base of Buddhist monuments. And of course, Fanigiri is a fantastic example, which is not very far away. But it's not that there weren't these monuments, but I think that this is the history that we have forgotten. Then in the lower Krishna Valley, of course, the legendary the Bhattiprolu inscription, which has the inscribed names of Vanitas and Vanyas and all. And then there are the relic caskets that were found there. And then the Sada coins. And at Amravati, of course, everybody knows, I mean, Amravati was butchered, no? Some went to the Madras Museum, some went to the British Museum, etc. And this is like a very old stupa in situ. Guntepalli Congregation Hall, and the base, only the base of the stupa. And you see, as I showed you, in coastal Andhra, there is every village has Buddhist remains. I mean, they all need to be documented and systematically put into a database. So, and of course, I love these faces. And all the places which I studied, this is the terracotta face from Vadamanu. And then here's Kondapur. You have, glazed red pottery and this fantastic Karwaan image. I can't find out what her ethnicity would be. I mean, all jewelry decked up. The Roman coins were used as jewelry as well, like amulets. And these wonderful smiling faces of terracotta of women. Again, these are, they are found in large numbers, and these beads, I've just given a sampling of some of the beads, but in the next slide, you will see how Yazdani found, he found them in hoards. You take a look at these images of the 1942 excavation. In large numbers, beads were found. These were the underground chambers he excavated. What were these underground chambers? Were merchants putting all their ware in these underground chambers? Then there are these furnaces to make iron tools, crucibles of iron over here. And then these are the more recent excavations which Maheshwari did. And this is where she says that she's found a circular structure rather than Chaitya-shaped structure. And at the base, at the entry of this, she found a inverted Lachagori. This is not the Lachagori which I put here, but another one, a more complete one. And of course, then at the corners of this circular thing, she found these, they're not visible in this picture, but there are these very deep holes with ash and so on and so forth, which she says were Vedic altars. So here we are, but at Kondapur, we have not found any Buddhist sculptures, and we also haven't found any symbols that would indicate that this was, a major Buddhist pilgrimage center. And this is Phanagiri, and the first row is Phanagiri viharas and small stupas. Of course, there are other better pictures. And then these, I wanted to just show you how the rock cut surfaces were used for water management, both in the north in Phanagiri as well as in Totlakonda. Even steps were cut into the rock for people to access and move down to have the water. And what Lars Fogan did at Totlakonda was that he walked each and every inch down from the vihara down to the village settlements, and whatever he found on the way he documented. It's like a fantastic study of these early monastic establishments in Andhra Pradesh. And this is Patancheru, the excavations done by the director of the ICRISAT, that they found a sun temple apparently, but what they are clearing out is this fantastic Viragal. Those of you who are from Telangana know that this is quite a common thing. These warriors, these very simple warriors with these weapons that are found, and their images are found everywhere. And they're probably these local headmen or local warrior chiefs that are found everywhere. Alongside in Patancheru, you also find lots of Nagas and Nagini images. At the same time, by the time you reach the Kakatiyan times, you also find very classical images of lady Dwarapalas. And in some senses, there is a kind of a remnants of the Buddhist contact over here, but they have like painted it, the local villagers. There's a village part of Patancheru and there's a ICRISAT part. I'll show you the ICRISAT part where you have all these wonderful cleaned images all put in. One of them, Kuber, the god Kuber, because being a Jain town and being a market town, Kuber of course had to be worshipped. A wonderful image of Kuber, which unfortunately was in the dining hall, the kitchen and dining hall area. They decorated it with Kuber. And then we looked at all these other images, all on ICRISAT, very clean, very sanitized, but totally out of context. So one doesn't really know where they came from, but must have come from when they started building ICRISAT over there. And then this is Amravati and Nagarjunakonda. And accessing the other, I'd just like you to take a look at the tunic dresses and churidar kind of panjamas of guards at Nagarjunkonda, a wine cup and these long mongoloid features and beards, very different, well, can we use the word foreign looking people or whatever, and you have the wonderful chenchus. It's just one, but there are about 10 to 12 such wonderful images of the local, probably chenchus, we don't know, but they are exhibiting a very lively, worldly kind of life, very far removed from a renunciation-oriented religion that was probably being preached at these sites. And then this overflowing Purnagata has an inscription, which is lo and behold donated by a charmakara, a leather worker, and his family and friends. Though his father is a teacher in the Buddhist Sangha, he and his family and friends coming from the charmakara donate this to the Buddhist Sangha. So here, this accessing the other part, I'm discussing all these features. And at Shravanabelagola, some of you are familiar, you may have visited, the entire rock surfaces have got these reliefs. And all these people are undergoing the famous renunciation-oriented, salankana, that is mortification of the body. And there are inscriptions and there are nuns and others attending to those that are under, not only at Shravanabelagola, there's another place called Koppagal and many places which became Jain Tirthas of the early medieval times. And here is Nanagarambura, where these are some of the people that I talked to and their histories. The interesting thing about Nanagarambura was that I did this after the formation of the Telangana state, and therefore the Maisamma shrines, the Pathukamma, and all these local festivals and all suddenly came of age. And this is something very significant, where they were all lying suppressed, or they were not like really being discussed. And then, of course, just a small picture of the ancient well and the ancient temple over there, also at Nanagarambura. So this was the last of the studies I did. So some scholarly, some historians would like really question why a kind of a contemporary study should be put within the category of early Deccan, but I wanted to make a point about continuity of settlements and that village settlements do not change so dramatically using the Annal School formula. I mean, if landscapes are not changing, till recently, the rocky landscapes, the water zones, so to speak, the way the lakes were connected to each other didn't change. It's only now that we are on the cusp of, well, we already have seen, we have been on a cusp of disaster in terms of the flooding of Hyderabad. But I think communities had been very protective of their environment, and many of the sacred shrines which we studied over here were lying in niches, in rocky niches, and so nobody destroyed them because they were there. And it's only the golf course that came along and banned these people from entering into that area, and so on and so forth. So this is what I wanted to share in terms of the photographs, and that's it. That's all I have to say. And should we go to the chat box, Ronita?
Yes, thank you so much for that, Professor. We have two brief questions. No, we have 3 questions on chat and 1 on YouTube. So I'm just going to read them out to you. So the first is from Juhi Ahmed. The question is, please share a bit more about Nanagarambura. What are the leftover bits of the settlements there? Never knew about the temple, which one and where?
Okay, so there's a Ranganath Swami temple, and the ancient part of that temple is in ruins, but it's still very much there, not protected by anybody because this is a private property of the Pitti family. But there is the niche, the Vishnu, Sheshashai Vishnu shrine over there, which is being worshipped currently. It's also got an intact plaque. The settlement has been encroached quite a lot. As I just mentioned, the golf course has come up. The sacred space of Nanagarambura is now under litigation because the MR properties have captured all these Sita Mata shrines and the Ayyappa shrines and so on. And see, all these village settlements didn't have big temples. Except for this Ranganath Swami temple, everything else are small Pochamma shrines or Maisamma shrines and all. So all these are getting impacted because the Pathukama festival also is very difficult to celebrate because the wildflowers near the lakes and near the lake bodies, the buffaloes have been sold, and now they have made houses for the so-called software engineers and their wives and their thing to come and live there. So there is a major dramatic change in the ecology as well as in the settlement pattern at Nanagarambura. It was lucky that we were able to document whatever little we documented over there. And their main Chevaru, their main, it's called Vipro Lake now. It is Madhubai Kunta, it's become Vipro Lake. And there's a Patel Kunta, and then there's another lake. Now it is in the ISB campus. So imagine the settlement was spread from the ISB campus right up till what is called the Outer Ring Road. It was actually a zamindari, Manikonda zamindari. No, the revenue rents and so on. So we were told that the 75 paisa or something like that, they had to pay revenue rents. And the access into Nanagarambura from Golidhoti was of course just a pastoral encampment site. There was no entry. I mean, there were rocks. They had to, travel through pagdandis and pathways to come, and they used to bring wood into Nanagarambura. But the fascinating thing is that we are talking about particularity, but we are also talking about contact with populations as far away as Uttar Pradesh, because these Lodhas came under as guards under the Nizam period, and they continued to remain guards. And in Hyderabad, there are many settlements of these Lodhas in Hyderabad. So, I mean, the history of communication. I forgot to mention there is a very famous archaeologist called V. Subbarao, who has written about areas of nuclear attraction, areas of isolation, and areas of relative isolation. And he puts the Deccan into areas of relative isolation because these are areas of communication. So people have always been moving and traveling in these areas. And as a result, you had a lot of different kind of populations, not just in the medieval period. Well before the medieval period, there have been many migratory patterns into this region. And so a small settlement like Nanagarambura yields 50% of the population of these people.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor. Yeah. Then Luna Banerjee asks if this is a type of microhistory.
The micro, so the whole of it is not a microhistory. Only this little last bit, perhaps we could put into the category of a microhistory, because this is like the smallest of the units that I looked at. But primarily, it is what we call settlement archaeology, archaeology of settlements. There's an entire thing called settlement archaeology. So within that, actually, the broad term that is used is landscape archaeology, because as I said, the written word, I mean, as far as textual material is not there, so mapping out settlements and looking at their nature. So I'm not just simply saying individual settlement will tell you about the whole region. You have to look at a cluster of settlements. And if you have to look at a cluster of settlements, then you have to divide a broader region into a sub-region, and then within the sub-region into a zone, which I call the which I call a locality actually. I don't call it a zone, I call it a locality. And then within the localities, maybe you have individual settlements, individual sites, individual, which is something that I've not really discussed in the presentation, but I do discuss that in the book. I should also show everybody the book. It's going to, if I can just publicize it, the global edition is going to be brought out by Routledge, UK. So all of you who are not living in India have to buy the global edition. The South Asia edition is out and available on Amazon and Flipkart.
Right. Thank you, Professor. So there are a lot of appreciative messages. Aside from those, I see 3 more questions. One is from Suchandra Ghosh, whose question reads, I am curious to know whether you have come across coastal settlements in the eastern seaboard apart from the major ones. I ask this as we have reference to 5 Mahanavikas and 7 Mahasartavahas in a 9th century copper plate of the eastern Chalukya ruler Vishnuvardhana, the 5th. there could have been vibrant coastal societies, but I really don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, nice. Yes, you see, for the inscriptions do refer to these, even the Telugu Kannada inscriptions and Telugu inscriptions. But for the early historic period, Himanshu Prabha Ray has looked at the mammoth of information that is there. Many of these settlements are now England, right? So, but the Coromandel coast was very difficult to navigate, and so therefore, actually on the coastline settlements are very difficult to find. But a little interior overlooking, like Totalakonda, Bavikonda and all these things are overlooking the ocean, right? But they are on the leeward side. So actually on the thing is difficult. Not only that, Nagarjunakonda, Amaravati, also at Kuntapalli, there are all the Navikas, the architects, all these professional names are found in large. But in particular, evidence of actual settlements to be identifiable as of now, that is very difficult, because there was a lot of change. The flow of the river Krishna, the way in which the delta portion has changed, the Godavari in particular much more. I mean, it was not as well inhabited in early historical times as the Krishna basin was. So these are all issues we have to bear in mind.
All right. Moving to the next question. Rachna Sinsanwar asks, is there any connection with Mathura in specific? Some of the ladies' sculptures look very much like they're from Mathura, and it was a Mahanagar Palika.
Well, the big debates that Sanchi, Mathura, Barut, the fact that people were traveling with the monks, influences may have come. But I think that it was the local artisans and local artists that made these images. And if you look at the ethnography, if you look at the faces and so on and so forth, many of them look very local, the designs of the jewelry and so on and so forth. But I am not able to sort of, forcefully say that, yes, indeed, people came from Mathura. In fact, I would like to mention, I should have mentioned that a fantastic study has been done, or studies have been done on Sanchi in terms of almost 700 inscriptions, and bit by bit systematic. I think we need to do that for many sites in the Deccan as well, a systematic way in which the community and the monks interacted with each other. So I think that yes, there were influences of Buddhist traveling. I mean, if we we can even say from Gandhara down to Sri Parvata, because Nagarjuna, the famous Buddhist, Mahayana Buddhist teacher, lived in Andhra, and so there were in another contest I have discussed, there are several schools of Mahayana Buddhist thinking that mushroomed in this part of the country. I mean, that is around Nagarjuna. In fact, many of them were Theravada monasteries that slowly became mine. There's a scholar called Joseph Balzer who has written about Nagarjuna text and context, and he has tried to identify some of these monasteries in the Andhra areas, also in Telangana, to argue that much of what went as Mahayana Buddhism in the Chinese context traveled from this part of the country. So it's not that people were not traveling, particularly the monks. And when Buddhism became such a powerful ideological force in this region, there were people from here also were traveling to other parts of the country. So there may have been influences, but I do believe that there were local Andhra Shilpins and local artists, terracotta makers and all who are making. There's a lot of similarity. You saw the people who were, images I showed you in the Godavari Delta and then in Kondapur and so on. And so there was some similarity in those terracottas.
May I ask a question, please?
Sure.
We have one pending question. May I
Okay.
just get through with that question, and then you could ask yours?
Sure,
Yeah.
thank you.
So we have one question from the YouTube live stream, Professor. The question is, How do you see the impact of Hippallus seasonal winds triggering Roman trade and their impact on the regions beyond Vindhyas?
Yeah, a lot. The discovery of the monsoons uh, and the periplus of the Erythraean Sea. In fact, I had noted it down somewhere that the zest with which all these historical settlements were being excavated, especially the Buddhist monuments and the walled towns, because the Greeks had referred to the Greeks and Romans had referred to the fabled 40 walled towns of the Andre. And so the discovery of the monsoons, AD 54, and after, especially, I showed you this map which Himanshu Prabhare has made of all the port towns on the way. These were all areas where trade with the Romans or the representatives of the Romans came not only to the Malabar but also to the Konkan coast, and through those very narrow passes got into the hinterland of the Deccan. So a lot of impact of the discovery of the monsoons and they have found hordes, not one or two, hordes of Roman coins, gold and silver Roman coins in many parts of the Deccan. Not only in Coimbatore and Kerala and Tamil Nadu, but also in many parts of Andhra and Telangana and so on and so forth. So and these people were so fascinated with these coins that they imitated these and made clay imitations of Roman coins and used them as jewelry, and also made holes. Many of the coins which are in the lockers of the State Department of Archaeology, and when you saw them, all of them had holes on the top. They were using it like tallis.
So, Professor, there's one last question on YouTube, which is that it is great to see your observations on local folks or deities. Can you share your opinion on Sanskritization of local folklores? Many Adivasis of Gond tribe have raised concerns on the same.
Yeah, so this is this process of Sanskritization, Brahmanization, Aryanization, Kshatriyization, all these izations. I think these are very simplistic models that we have been, blatantly using. For the period that I'm discussing, we don't have issues because we are really not talking about large-scale transformation of local shrines into Brahmanical temples or whatever. But what we do have is the integration of yakshas, yakshinis, nagas, nagadevatas, etc. into even within the Buddhist context. This is something that scholars have written a lot about. Kinnaras, half human, half animal, naginis, all this was possibly integrated into both Jain and Buddhist monuments. But the period that I'm discussing, there's no large-scale Sanskritization, so to speak. It does begin to happen in the early medieval period. And then the question, I mean, that's a totally different topic. I mean, I have different views on that, that the way in which the local shrines are subsumed within the Brahmanized thing happens in some key zones that become major pilgrim centers. But I think that they also continue to exist because my study of Nanagarambura showed that the Pochamma shrine or the Maisamma shrine remained the Maisamma shrine, where that chicken is sacrificed and all these things are done, and the full moon time the people come and celebrate over there. The change happened at this village when you have a whole lot of these SEZ companies coming, and then suddenly one fine day we found that the Maisamma has become Ma Durga. So this is happening in 2016. But till 2016, and even in 2014, 12, when we were visiting this is Hyderabad, this is a major urban center, we're sitting the backyard of the university, there were these local shrines that were continued to remain local shrines. And these Naga Naganis, even some of the people over here like Juhi and others, we all went to Ikrisat and we found that the Naga Nagani sculptures, very ancient sculptures, are still being worshipped as Naga Naganis. There is no Brahmanical temple or no other temple. But these very powerful ideas of creativity and creative elements being integrated into the Buddhist pantheon was also something that happened. My argument over here, therefore, is that in the early Deccan society, on the one hand, the particularity of these local shrines has remained. On the other hand, when Buddhism, Jainism came, they integrated some of it. And in many cases, the Buddhist stupa is over a megalithic burial site, because the relics, the stupa is also a worship of relics. Megalithic people were also worshipping the sacred relics and so on and so forth. Okay, so I think that we have to, your question is very valid, but I think that that's exactly what my point was, that I'm like really, disturbed by these generalizations, that there is a pan-Indian generalizations and these izations of where Sanskrit language, Kshatriyas as a thing. I mean, there are so many local chiefs, no? They have their own, there are no coins anywhere else in India with these names, these legends that you have on these local coins. We don't find any other part of the country having these names. The Mahatalvaras, the Gopas, the Hastins, the Sadas, right? The rest of India, these legendary coins comes much later. Even the great imperial, so-called imperial Mauryas had only punch mark coins. So I think this is exactly my point, the particularity of regions, the way we do regional history, how we need to question some theorizations and happen like in this general way, as though every settlement became Brahmanized or Sanskritized and so on. Where did it happen? Why did it happen? What form did it take? I have some material on that. You can contact me and I can discuss that with you later.
Thank you so much for that, Professor. We are almost out of time.
Yeah.
So we have two questions, one from the speaker who spoke a little while ago and one in the chat, which can we forward those to you for you to respond to them?
Yeah, sure. I will do that. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much for that. I mean, I did my entire schooling in Karnataka. I had never heard of half the things you mentioned. So, and clearly even people who are professionally like following histories at an academic level also don't have as clear an idea of this as they do of other regions of the country. So thank you for animating these slices of history so wonderfully, Professor. Thank you.
The question from the audience. Where was
yes, I had, but she says there's no time.
You can ask a quick question.
Yeah, quick question. This is more for students engaged with history.
Yeah.
All the research that's so fascinating that you discussed today, and very true. Everything is generalized, when which should be region focused. Will your work and findings find a place in school history books or college history books? Because students need to be aware of current updates of findings instead of all the old books and authors that we are still continuing with.
Yes, absolutely. You are a very pertinent question. And one is involved with informing scholars who are writing school textbooks and particularly college textbooks. I mean, I'm located in Hyderabad, so the government of Telangana is like very, very serious about relooking at whatever is the history of Telangana. Similarly, the history of Andhra Pradesh and other. See, the thing is that to get all this research in a systematic form, we really need to have teamwork.
Correct.
Okay, so this can't be done by one individual. I think we have to identify. I mean, I'm reminded of the Eklavya project. Looking at the tribal histories of different parts of the country. I mean, particularly in Madhya Pradesh, writing in the local language, getting it access to school children of smaller areas and small. I did for the Nanagarambura and all that. I did a documentary thing, and I went and showed it, and in schools and in these areas. And I think that it sort of resonated with school children a lot. So I think we need to do teamwork and we have to organize this. But there have been a lot of queries, especially in because the rewriting of the history project always happens. As you know. After the breakdown of the Soviet Union, people were writing histories of Turkmenistan and Tajikistan and all, and they wanted to erase all their Persian and Russian histories, and they wanted to write their Turk history. So similarly, here also now, I mean, there is this concern, and I think that I'm not trying to romanticize the local. What I'm trying to say is let's look from below above and integrate the local into a kind of a narrative so that we have a more holistic view of what the country's culture and traditions were. Because there is a meaning of these traditions for the people that are still living in different levels of social and economic development. You know, they're not like all of them are not like you and me.
No, it's all seems to be in the past, every time in the past.
I know, for these people, the past is not some alien land like how you and me look at the past, distant past. For them, it's very much their present. I learned a lot about what we should understand as history. Actually, French scholars like Michel Ducerton and others have been discussing this seriously, to how and why we really need to talk about, memory as a very important element. Rather than just the archival word. The archival word is very delimiting.
And we remain ignorant for life.
Yeah, okay. Ranita is the timekeeper and she's getting very annoyed.
Sorry, no, I'm not getting annoyed, not at all. It's just, I mean, you have also been talking for a long time. It would be nice if you could
it's
also...
okay.
All right.
Oh, it's okay. We don't get much opportunity to talk a lot these days.
All right. In that case, I'm just including the last question as well, since it makes no sense for just one question to be sent to you in writing. So the question is, it is being suggested that Harappan script was Gond culture based. Are there any views on the ancestral connection and base in Harappan civilization?
So sorry that I won't be able to answer this question, but I do know that our the indigenous language group in our university has been transcribing some of the tribal languages, and maybe I can find out a bit about this. But I do think, I mean, in a cursory way, I do think it's too far-fetched to think of the Harappan. I mean, people have tried a lot about the Harappan script and it being a Proto-Dravidian, and so, I mean, this is a question I cannot answer, but I can ask the group that is looking at these languages, the indigenous languages, because the mother tongue studies and so on and so forth, people are doing. And one thing I can say that there has been in recent years, I don't know whether Bangaya is still here, but people have been doing a lot of studies on the Gonds and the Lambaras and others, and they have been trying to access the oral histories of these communities. So in modern times, in colonial times, we can go back to the Bhils. In fact, now I have to participate with Ajay Sakaria's talk on, he's worked a lot on this issue. There is an interest, there's a serious interest, and maybe this question is emanating out of that. And also the previous question about the concern of this subsuming of all the shrines under a Brahmanical, monolithization of culture. So I won't be able to answer that question, sadly. I have to end by saying, no, I can't answer.
Right. Thank you so much, Professor. I'm sure even if you weren't able to answer that directly, that was more helpful, I suppose, than you could have been. You've offered to do some further looking up. So
I want to thank all these lovely people who have joined, and some of them are like I haven't met for a long time. But thank you all so much, and please do send your critical comments if you lay your hands on the book. I mean, this was a sequel to the earlier book on the Deccan. Maybe there should be another taking. I mean, I haven't done much on Karnataka. My Kannadiga friends were saying that, why didn't you write more about Karnataka? I mean, I just don't have the material so easily available. So will you all please send critical comments and suggestions? Maybe we can all carry this forward.
Sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Megha.
Thank you so much. When we were, discussing doing this, I knew that it was going to be fascinating. But this has been fascinating beyond expectations. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. History for Peace is always a fantastic forum to be on, and I will continue to join your wonderful sessions as and when they happen.
Thank you so much.
Right, we'll be in touch. Yeah. Okay, bye everybody. Bye.
On that note, Professor.
Yeah.
Hello. Yes, on that note, we have a couple of announcements to make about upcoming events. Okay. So you can get the update now as well. So on the 9th of December, we have, continuing our collaboration with Karwaan, we have a social science teachers special session with the historian Shekhar Bandyopadhyay on decolonization. So if you check out our Facebook page, the video link to Karwaan's talk with the professor is already present. So we are inviting questions from social science teachers across the country based on that talk for Professor Bandyopadhyay. And so the deadline for that is the 3rd of December. So we invite your questions. The second quick announcement, which you will see more about on our Facebook pages and our other social media pages, is that we have an exciting conversation coming up next Saturday on the history of dissent to be, and the people conversing are going to be the historians Romila Thapar, Kunal Chakraborty, and Professors Apurvanand, and one second.
Suhas Palshikar.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I was confused about the last name. Yes, and Suhas Palshikar. So that will be next Saturday, and the deadline for the Shekhar Bandyopadhyay questions is the 3rd of December. So we're looking forward to both the questions and to seeing all of you on Saturday. Thank you so much again.
Yeah. Okay, bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.